Good afternoon, everyone. And I think we got a lot of people in the back, so hopefully the sound is working and everyone can hear us. I'm John Podesta, the president of the Center for American Progress. We're very pleased today to be joined by former Prime Minister Tony Blair. We'll be joined in a few minutes by Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, and several key distinguished education leaders from the United States to discuss community schools here and abroad. So what are community schools? They're schools that stay open for extended hours, offer students and families access to important social and health services, and seek to become centers of community life by promoting parent and community investment in the school. The promotion of community schools has been a priority for this center since its inception over 6 years ago. One of the first things we did in forming the center was to form a task force on what needed to happen in public education, which we did for the Institute for America's Future. And I think one of the main recommendations of that task force that was co-chaired by Janet Napolitano, who now is the director who is our secretary here, and along with several other people. One of the main recommendations of that report, which was called Renewing Our Schools, Securing Our Future, was this focus on community-based education. The task force recommended that community schools can improve student outcomes by meeting the unmet non-academic needs of students, particularly those of low-income families. Today, we're issuing a report by Saba Barada that updates our review of successful community schools in a diverse set of districts, from Chicago and New York to Arlington, Virginia, Maryland, and Portland, Oregon. We see this movement spreading, I think, really across the country. And we're especially pleased that through a generous grant from J.P. Morgan Chase, the center is able to continue our work and now to provide a platform to discuss community schools as part of a national education strategy, which was, I think, the focus of Tony Blair when he was in office. This event brings together the leading players on the issue, and we hope that our conversation today will significantly propel a federal financial commitment to community schools, as I think particularly Congressman Hoyer will discuss. We're very pleased that former Prime Minister Tony Blair is here to help us consider the importance of community schools and to share with us how he built a national consensus to support them. As I'm sure you all know, Mr. Blair served as Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland from May of 1997 to June of 2007. After stepping down as Prime Minister, he was named official envoy to the Quartet on the Middle East, which he continues to work at, representing the United States, the United Nations, Russia, and the European Union, in helping particularly the Palestinians to prepare for statehood as part of the international community's effort to secure peace. He's launched two foundations, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and the Tony Blair Sports Foundation. During Mr. Blair's time as Prime Minister, this is probably less well known in the United States, he placed great emphasis on how government works, focusing on efficiency, on productivity, and on delivering tangible, measurable results. Michael Barber joins us today, who helped him lead in those efforts. And we hope to learn from his success as we design progressive reform strategies in the United States across the board, really, across our overall investments in public goods. As part of that effort, Tony developed major education reform initiatives in Great Britain, including the national adoption of an extended school strategy. Extended schools, like American community schools, stay open longer and provide a menu of services to students and to families. England has invested millions of pounds in the transformation of its schools to extended schools and expects that all schools will offer extended services by the year 2010. Mr. Blair oversaw these efforts, and we can all learn from his experiences in bringing this monumental change, really, to the way education services are delivered in UK schools. So please join me in welcoming Tony Blair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here this afternoon, and to thank John and the Center for American Progress for hosting this event. The Center for American Progress under John's leadership is actually becoming an organization of worldwide renown. Actually, a lot of us are studying what you're doing here and hoping to learn from you. I'd also like to thank very much Judy Diamond for all the work that she's done in trying to support your program for community schools, and all of you who are engaged in the education field. And a particular hello to Sir Michael Barber, who's the guy who used to do my education reforms. So anything that worked was to my credit, and anything that didn't was his fault. Which I always think is the right relationship between the leader and the public servant. And the first thing I really wanted to say to you is that, I mean, we spent a lot of time making change. And here's the thing. Making change is not easy. I used to, by the time I finished my time as Prime Minister, I discovered that when you first propose a change, everybody tells you it's going to be disastrous. Whilst you're making the change, life is hell. And after the change is made, people assume that it was always like that, and why wasn't there more of it? So, and I remember not in education reform, but in healthcare reform, and I think you may know something a little bit about that here in the US as well. But I remember the height of our healthcare reforms, which now really have taken the National Health Service. Actually is not a huge issue right now in Britain in the same way that it was when we came to power, precisely because the reforms have had a big impact on the healthcare system. But I remember right at the height of those reforms, and which had great opposition from within the healthcare field, and I went and had unfortunately I had to have a small operation in hospital. So I go into hospital, I'm lying in the bed there, and the anaesthetist guy comes in with a very large-looking needle and leans over the bed, and he says, his opening words to me is, "Mr. Blair, I may not get the chance to say this to you again," which is not... that wasn't a great start. And then he just said, "I'd just like to tell you I'm totally opposed to your health service reforms." So I learned it was never easy making change. And I learned a lot of lessons, good and bad, from the experience. So let me try and share those with you. I mean, first of all, some guiding principles. And I'll talk specifically about community schools, but I'll try and set it within the broader framework of reform. I mean, as guiding principles, well, obviously, human capital is what determines a nation's success today. I mean, it's obvious, but you need to say it and repeat it. I believe that poor education is the single biggest social injustice a child can have. A child can, especially with help, get through in circumstances of poverty, but a child that is given a poor education will very often remain poor. A child that is given the chance of a great education can make something of themselves. So education is the great human liberator, in my view. Also, I think as policymakers, I ended up feeling this about making policy in the field of education, that if it wasn't good enough for my child, it shouldn't be good enough for anybody else's. And I actually came in the end to believe that you had to approach education policy as a parent first. Right? That is what then got you in the groove, as it were. So that when you came to look at policy, you looked at it in a very, very personal way. Is it something that's really going to help the child or not? I think the other guiding principle is that money is important, and we made major changes in investment in our education system. We increased the investment dramatically by the largest amount that any government had ever done since the war. But I am absolutely convinced money alone is not the answer. You can put as much money as you want into the system, but if you don't accompany it by the right reform, then it won't work. So those are the kind of guiding principles. What are the challenges? The challenges, and this is the reason why community schools are so important, is that the poor kids are often, even usually, in the worst schools. And they're congregated together as well, many times. In many education systems, this isn't incidentally something that's just for the US system or the UK system. You can see it all over the world. Also, many of these young people will have family problems as well as educational challenges. In other words, their issue is not just about the time they're in school. Their issue is obviously often their life circumstances, how they're being brought up, the community in which they're living, the multiple challenges of life, particularly for some of the poorest and most disadvantaged children. Another challenge, and I'll be very frank about this, but it's not always a popular thing to say. I think in respect of teachers' unions, we have to seek a partnership, but we should refuse a veto. Now, that is sometimes not one of the world's most popular things to say, but I think it's important because it does set the framework within which we then try to make policy. And I think the final part I put under the heading of challenges is that when you come to failing schools, I mean, this is what we found. We could identify failing schools, and we actually took some very radical and pretty draconian measures towards them because I believed that every time there was a failing school, that was a whole lot of children whose life chances were being shortened. But I actually also came to the view in the end that there was a problem with failing schools, but that wasn't the only problem. There was also a problem with schools that were what I would call mediocre or coasting, we used to call them. In other words, they'd be kind of, moving along, underperforming, but not so drastically that people would say, oh my God, you've got to do something about that school. But actually just not doing as well as they could or should. And that also, I think, is a major issue within our education systems. So those are the challenges. Now, here is what I think about education reform, which I would say is different from many other areas of public service reform. I mean, I think, the issues to do with healthcare are really, really tough. And, around the world, everyone's always searching for the perfect healthcare system. And, if any of your political leaders were intelligent enough, they'd go and find it and implement it. And actually, it's not like that. And many things to do with pension reform. These types of issues can be incredibly difficult. I think the interesting thing about education reform is actually we kind of do know what works. I mean, what's hard is implementing it. It's actually less hard to identify what works, what actually goes to make a good school and a good education. And here are some of the things that we came to on the basis of 10 years of empirical experience in doing reform. I think the school that's successful has a sense of its own identity. It has, in a way, a kind of independent ethos. It's not just a school that you go to. And the name means something. You name the school. It means something. It conjures up, often, an ethos of something that you feel pride in and ownership of. That always goes with strong leadership in my experience. You occasionally got bad schools that had strong leaders, but I never actually came across a good school with a weak leader. So that leadership and ethos is very, very important. And one of the reasons why it's important is this, that, and we found this with the academy schools that we created, which are rather like your charter schools, I think, where there would be a lot of power, a lot of independence for the schools. They were able to innovate and adapt and do new things because they had that sense that they weren't part of a big system. They actually were their own almost self-governing unit. I actually think community or extended schools, the empirical evidence from us is that works too. And there's a very simple reason for that. What matters to those children is not simply what happens between 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That is absolutely clear. In other words, the school should become, if you like, a centre for the support and nurture of the future generation, not simply education in the narrow sense, and a hub for the whole of the community. It should be a resource and a source of strength, not just for the people, the children, the students that go in the school door, but also for the whole of the community. So what we found with our community schools, extended schools as we call them, using the facilities for adult learning. Because actually one of the problems often with parents is that if they've had a poor education, sometimes they that is a disadvantage for them, obviously, but it's also a disadvantage for their children when their children are trying to learn. Breakfast clubs, and after-school clubs. Again, for some children, particularly those from problem or disadvantaged families, they may not have breakfast before they get to school. That's a problem for their education. It's a problem for their concentration. It's a problem for the way they behave at school. Youth development, dealing with some of the mental stresses and strains, as well as the physical shortcomings. Making sure, for example, for some kids, they can't go home and do their homework. I mean, it's not possible for them to do that. So you need to provide for that to be done. Now, by the end of next year, as John was saying to you, all our schools will be extended schools. We're actually getting this down to primary school level. I don't know, is that junior school? I don't know, whatever you call it. But it's a very, very important part of making education about the whole person and about the whole community. And I think the lesson we learn is that definitely works and is important to do. Next thing that works, good teachers are really good. Bad teachers shouldn't be teaching. I'm afraid you can't, if people can't do the job properly, it's a problem. And it's a problem for the children that they're teaching. And again, that's difficult to say, but I think it's true. Another thing we learned, partnerships enrich the school. One of the reasons why we created trust schools and academies, and actually virtually all the UK secondary schools now will have partnerships of one sort or another. Now, sometimes they're business partnerships. Sometimes there will be individual philanthropists who will have a relationship with a school. Sometimes they're community organizations. There might be educational trusts. But the fact is, those partnerships, they bring in ideas and energy and creativity. And one of the things we found in opening up our school system was that when these partnerships happen, at first there can be a lot of opposition to them. But actually, after a time, people realize that there's a whole different dimension to doing things and ways of working out there. And schools can benefit from that, just like any other types of institution. Discipline, you've got to have that. I mean, it's an absolutely essential part. I mean, the thing I feel saddest about is when you get youngsters maybe in difficult schools, they want to learn, they simply can't learn without a proper discipline around. Hi. Good to see you. And, if that discipline is there, then they've got a chance of learning. But if it isn't, they don't. Parents need to be engaged and challenged. The fact is, if your parents aren't part of the school community, if they're not in there being talked to, helping, understanding where they've got to step up to the mark as well as the school, it won't work. And finally, a little plea, and Arne will be interested in this, sport I think is really important too. I think sport is a major but often underplayed part of giving kids a sense of partnership and responsibility and decency early in life. So, as I say, I think the interesting thing is, whatever the challenges, actually we know what works. That independent, strong ethos, the notion of a community school, the idea that you're going to get the parents properly engaged, that teaching has to have certain standards to it, that there's discipline, that there's the whole child or student is being looked after. So, we know what the challenges are. We kind of know what the solutions are. So what's the strategy to get there? I think I would say these things. First, it actually helps if people understand this is part of a bigger picture. What's happening in government generally, not just in education in the school system, but in government more generally, is that we're moving towards units that are more devolved, where government plays an enabling or strategic role but doesn't try to do everything itself. We're trying to move towards structures that are non-bureaucratic. Actually, in the school system, we're trying to move to situations where we break down some of the traditional demarcations. I mean, occasionally, in our academy schools, like your charter schools, we will have schools that decide, actually, we're going to change our skill mix. It's not simply going to be traditional teachers that we have in here. We may have people who come in, for example, to do arts or culture or sport. We may have people who come in that perhaps are are people who give up some of their time to teach kids about the careers that are available to them. You know, it's all part of a system, and you can see this right across public service reform, where government stops being a heavy hand and starts to be a support for the creativity, the innovation, and the leadership capability of the front line. And one of the things that we found, not just in the education field, but right across the piece, was that in today's world, as in so much else, actually your school unit does want to think of itself as having some independence, some freedom to innovate, to be flexible, to offer the best that it can do according to what it thinks. And that actually somebody sitting back in our case, Whitehall, in your case, whatever the equivalent is, and saying, right, you know, we can work out what your school should be doing. You know, we could, here's 500 pages of documentation about what your school should be doing. It just drives people crazy. However, if you are going to devolve, the second thing about how to get there is that structures do matter to standards. I actually came to power in 1997, and I had this line which said, we're going to focus on standards, not structures. And about 3 years in, I went in, I think Michael remembers that, and I said, I think this is wrong. In fact, I'm not going to say it anymore, because every time I say it, I want to then contradict myself, which is not a great position for a political leader to be in, although one not entirely unfamiliar to me in my time in office. But you know, actually the structures matter. So when you're thinking about, in the case of what we're talking about today, community schools, providing the right structures for this to be incentivized and developed is important. I actually believed in the end that our move to a far more we actually ended up with our schools, most of our secondary schools will now become self-governing trusts effectively. So they will have a great deal of freedom and flexibility. And I think structures matter. Structures do determine the setting within which people take those decisions. And one of the things that I also think matters is throwing the system open to new providers as well. You know, the fact is, in any other walk of life, it doesn't stay still and static. You know, one of the biggest problems, the whole government reform area, I always used to say this, you know, in our first term in office, that if Clement Attlee, who was the British Prime Minister in 1945, came back to the UK in the year 2000, he wouldn't recognise anything about the UK very much, except government. He'd recognise that. That had just gone on in the same way, doing the same thing. So I do believe it's important as part of the structural change also to allow in new providers, people with new ideas. And it's not just, you can flog the existing system harder. And you can always get a few results if you do that. But actually, if you change the system, you're going to do a whole lot better and achieve a whole lot more. Track performance, get the right data, monitor it, and act fast. That's one thing we learned absolutely. You know, for schools failing it, you've got to, don't wait 5 years. That's 5 years of a child's life getting bad education. You know, don't wait. So I think how you get the right performance data and how you use that data is of immense importance. Like running any organization, you know, and this is where, again, sometimes in public service reform, we've got to be kind of bold here and realize there's lots of differences with a private sector organization. Actually, there's lots of similarities. One is you've got to get the data, you've got to track it, you've got to monitor it, and you've got to act if it's not up to scratch. And I guess the final thing I'd say is this, that you've got to go for it, really. I mean, I can honestly tell you this in this area, at least, of policy. I never regretted a bold move, and I always regretted a cautious one. And the truth is, the change that you need is change that people know they need and they want it. And that's why it's important that you have a debate and a conversation that is as broad as possible, but is not confined to the education community. It's got to include the whole community. mean, if you take the principle of community schools being that the whole community is involved, make the conversation with the whole community. Because what they will tell you is not often things that you want to hear or things that are easy to do, but it will be the truth about how they find their local schools and the system in which they live. And this has got to be about public interest and not vested interest. And the final thing I'd say is this, that I actually believe with education, and I'm delighted, and Arne has had a great track record before in Chicago, and is there are a lot of people around the world watching what you're doing now, and I wish you every strength and success. But I also think that the fact that the president has shown so much personal interest in this is really important. To me, I mean, I came to the conclusion in the end that education is not an education policy; it's a national mission. It is of an absolutely determining nature, and the reason I came to that view is very, very simple, and it's based on my personal experience, which is why I say, approach this like a parent and not a politician. I know that I was really lucky and I got a privileged education. I absolutely know if I hadn't been, that my life would have been, I would have had a lot less opportunity and a lot less chance to develop potential. Now, there are people, and there are brilliant people, who you could put them with the most terrible set of circumstances and the poorest education, they'll rise to the top. But I know I'm not one of those people. I know I'm one of those people that actually need a helping hand. And I needed to learn. And I needed what learning gives you, which is actually an inner confidence and belief. That is the single most exciting thing in watching a child be educated well. And in some of the schools which we changed, you could go in those schools and you could see kids, and they came from the poorest backgrounds, and you could just feel how they were blossoming and flowering and developing as a result of a good education. That is not a small bureaucratic item of policy. That is the greatest gift that politics can bestow on the people of a society. And so that's why when you're talking about community schools today, it's worth keeping in our minds what our goal is. And that is so that these children, in whatever circumstances they've been brought up, which they cannot change, we should give them the ability to be the most that they can be through the gift of good education. Thank you.
Well, that was just terrific. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce Arne Duncan, who became the Secretary of Education on January 20th, 2009. Prior to his appointment as Secretary, he was the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, of which I consider myself a proud alumnus. He held that title from 2001 to 2008, making him the longest serving big city superintendent in the country, which tells you something about how hard that job is, given the short half-life of most of your peers. As superintendent, he launched the Chicago Public Schools Community Schools Initiative, a public-private effort to increase the number of community schools in Chicago. Arne's created an office of extended learning opportunities to help support community school development. By 2008, there were 150 community schools in Chicago, about a quarter of the total number of schools there. As Secretary, he continues to support the expansion of community schools, as well as a major Obama initiative to create promised neighborhoods based on Harlem's children's zone model across the country. I want to start by asking you, Arne, a question, which is, we've focused over the past probably 2 decades on a lot on education reform, from accountability, testing, high schools, teacher effectiveness, charter schools, etc. The UK put a lot of effort, as Tony Blair just mentioned, in this concept of rooting extended schools as part of a community-based effort to really push education reform forward. I think we just did this report on community schools in the U.S. Here it still seems more like an experiment, like it's one more thing on the list. How central is it to actually achieving the range of education reform efforts that you're trying to do with Race to the Top and everything else?
I think they're absolutely critical. First, let me say we've learned so much from what you guys did. It's pretty remarkable, the leadership that you provide, Mr. Prime Minister. Michael Barber's been someone I've listened to very, very closely. And these things are not in conflict. We need high standards. We need sort of national assessments. These guys have had it. We haven't done that. We got 48 states working hard on that. And we need our schools, every single school, to be open much longer hours and serving the community. And these things aren't in conflict. And I would argue that we have to move very aggressively, to the Prime Minister's point, and be bold in all of these areas. Schools that are open 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year don't meet anyone's needs anymore. They don't meet middle-class families' needs. They don't meet single moms' needs. They don't meet the needs of children who are coming from no-parent homes. Our schools have to be open much longer hours with a wide variety of after-school activities for children and for parents. And when children learn and families learn together and the schools are heart of the community, great things happen for children. Rich, poor, black, white, Latino, doesn't matter. When schools are islands from the community, when they're separated from the community, children suffer. And so I think we have to move with a huge sense of urgency in all of these areas. And I will tell you, we did lots of things in Chicago that were tough and controversial and hard. Our movement to get 150 community schools had no natural enemies. Everybody was on board with it. This is the one area where you're not going to, where everyone benefits. Teachers benefit, children benefit, families benefit, schools ultimately benefit. And this is one we just have to push extraordinarily hard.
So not in conflict or central to reform?
Both. Not in conflict and central to reform. Both.
Mr. Blair, what you were loading a lot onto the existing leadership of schools, who probably, as leaders in our own schools, feel to some extent beleaguered today in terms of the tough job that they have. How did you buy in the leadership in those schools to ask them to do more? Obviously, there was some financial incentive to do that, but what was your strategy with respect particularly to principals and teachers?
Well, I'm not sure we always got the strategy right, to be frank, but I mean, we invested a massive amount in schools and in teachers pay and all of that. I actually, though, came to the conclusion in the end that you had to be very careful of this trade-off between what you impose from the center and what and this is why structure is important, because you see, you can't just say to the school, just get on with it. Okay, and the very reason you've got a government with a policy is because you can't just say get on with it. It doesn't matter how bad it is, you've got to put up with it. On the other hand, I think if you create the right structure, then it's a lot easier for the government to be more strategic in the direction it's giving and to let the school then take some critical decisions itself. So, this is not so much in the extended school area, which, Arne's absolutely right. I mean, it was actually pretty easy to get people to buy into this. It's taken time to do, mind you, but I think people bought into it. But when we came to sort of academies, self-governing trusts and so on, that was a lot tougher.
Arne, what maybe in Chicago, kind of the same question. How did principals deal with now running an operation that wasn't just about getting greater performance out of their students, but having to run essentially a community-based social service network?
It's a great question, and I was actually pretty concerned. We knew this was the right thing to do when I started. I think we had about 6 community schools out of 600, so 1%, and we wanted to grow this pretty dramatically. So we put a little money aside and decided to do an RFP, a request for proposals. So this wasn't imposed on principals. And I was worried we could do this and nobody might apply. We'd have this good idea and good money and no one would bite at it. At the end of the day, we were limited at 150 just based upon resources. There was a huge amount of interest. So this has to come from the community, what principals saw, and there was absolutely initial reluctance. Your buildings open longer hours, who pays for what, who's in control of what, letting go, that's not something we as educators always do easily. But I would tell you, because the results were so dramatic, principals talking to principals created in 2 or 3 years a huge amount of demand. I just saw Beth Swanson was here, did a lot of work, and Judy Diamond sort of leading that effort. This was where government, nonprofit, the philanthropic sector, local money, state money, federal money is by far the biggest leverage dollars that we spent. 6 to 1, 7 to 1 for everything we were doing. But having everyone invest and be part of the solution was hugely, hugely important.
Was the principal the leader of that effort and sort of trying to put that together?
The principal had to be a piece of it. What you needed was a person at that school. So the principal buy-in is important, but it could be the assistant principal. It could be a social worker. You just need one adult there to be the bridge. Ultimately, what we're trying to do now is train a new generation of this hybrid between social workers and educators. And the principal can run the school 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and this new person, what do you want, program coordinator, resource coordinator, can run the school 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock. I don't know why we continue to build Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs. I think we should just put in all of our scarce resources into children and into education, into tutoring, into after-school programs. We have all these phenomenal nonprofits around the country. Everyone is hurting for money now, tough economy. Let's get out of the bricks and mortar business. In every community in this country, rich, poor, doesn't matter, you have schools. In every school you have classrooms, you have libraries, you have computer labs, you have gyms, some have pools. There are these great, great physical resources. They don't belong to the principal, they don't belong to me, they belong to the community. And we need to think very, very differently about that. So this is not just the school working 14 hours. It's about bringing in the community partners to extend the hours in which that building is open to serve the entire community.
Tony, was that a similar approach? Did the philanthropic community support the effort? Did the business community buy in, tie in to the movement? Or
absolutely. I mean, first of all, we were obviously investing. We were building a lot, particularly of sports facilities and so on. But Arne's absolutely right. I mean, the thing that was completely bizarre is you would have this extraordinary facility, right, in the middle of a community, and for the majority of time it wouldn't be used. Now, obviously, for example, with a sports facility, so we have people who are specifically sports coordinators for the schools and so on now, and those facilities then can be used for adults as well. They can be used for after-school activities for the kids, but often it won't be a traditional teacher that provides those activities. We found that local business people were prepared to come and help. For example, they would do kind of careers advice for the children. They might, some of the youngsters, it would never occur to them what the range of careers. I mean, if you were lucky enough to be what we call middle class, and I'm not quite sure where it fits into the class, very British thing, the spectrum here. But if you're sort of from a comfortably off family, your career opportunities will often be greatly explained to you. If you're from a poor background, often you have no idea what the careers are out there. Now, so one of the things you do with the extended school is you'd also have an engagement with the local community who would come in and say, well, look, here are the career opportunities that are here. And obviously then things like health and social services, this become a really, really important part of it. But once you get this going, I mean, it does require a different attitude of mind, and that's what I think is important. It's not just about the principal. It's about the school deciding that it's got a somewhat different posture vis-a-vis its local community. That's what we found. But by and large, they do. I mean, that's the good news.
And did the parents immediately take ownership of that, or was that a challenge to
No, that was a challenge. That was a challenge we had to push. I mean, it's happened. And it has happened, and I think this thing will now be extended greatly. But no, that's a challenge. It's always a challenge when you're challenging what is a very traditional conceptual notion of what is school. And one of the things that we do, particularly in some of the new schools we're creating now, is that we are now encouraging the heads to be quite assertive for the parents. The parents also have got to be brought in and made part of this whole thing. And sometimes they kind of say, well, the school, you educate the child. So there you are. You could.
Well, I think in your comments at the podium, you reflected on the fact that oftentimes, particularly for poor kids, I mean, they're going home without resources in the home. So the capacity to draw parents who essentially are having struggles and difficulties themselves into this school-based approach or this community-based approach is itself challenging. Arne, maybe I ask you the same question. How'd you get parents to buy into the ownership of it, and and then what's the progress? What progress have you made on it?
I really do believe sort of in this field of dreams idea that if we build it, they will come. And I think we have to be very self-critical and look in the mirror. Lots of times, we as educators, we have not welcomed parents into schools. They're supposed to drop their kids off in the morning, pick them up in the afternoon, and sort of not be seen. This is a fundamental change in culture, and that can be scary to sort of have parents there during the day and after school. But I will tell you, when you do GED classes, when you do ESL classes, when you do family literacy nights, when you do counseling, when you have healthcare clinics there, we had a set of schools where you had literally 100 to 150 parents coming to school every day, not for their children's education, but for their own. And when families learn together, children are going to do extraordinarily well. And so I think it's really a matter of us looking in the mirror and say, are we creating a climate in which parents feel comfortable? And we got to be really frank. A lot of our poor families, why are they poor? It's because they didn't get a good education. That's why they're poor. And so they've had these horrendous lifelong and failure experiences in school, and we're trying to overcome that. And so it takes knocking on doors. It takes doing outreach. It takes bringing them in. But when you do it and when you provide real opportunities and real engagement, if you have a parental board to help shape what's going on, they will come in droves. They will come in droves. And food helps. You got to feed people.
At the national level, Arne, what do we need to do for this to take off? Is this just about financial resources? Yeah. What needs to happen with respect to what the federal government can do to encourage this to take place in state and local communities?
I think this is a huge moment of opportunity. What needs to happen is we need to fundamentally agree that 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year is broken. That's it's a 19th century model. It doesn't work. I keep saying it's based upon an agrarian economy, and our kids aren't working the fields anymore. And so what we have to do collectively is say every school, and Children's Aid Society is here, Jane Quinn has done great, every school, just if they made a commitment in Great Britain, every school needs to be open these extended hours. And this can't be sort of a separate program. This has to be embedded in everything we do. So when we talk about Race to the Top, when we talk about school improvement grants, we have unprecedented discretionary resources to invest. One of the biggest things we can do is get more time and use these resources to extend what we're doing. This is not just about more money. It's about thinking differently. If we invite the YMCAs in and the Boys and Girls Clubs in and don't charge them rent, we all save money. So it's part of it is resources. Part of it is just simply a different mentality, and that the current model of a school doesn't work for middle-income kids, doesn't work for poor children, doesn't work for two-parent families, doesn't work for single moms. It doesn't work for so many of our children who are basically going home to no-parent families. It's a broken model, and why we continue to perpetuate it doesn't make sense.
Did the community schools in Chicago stay open during the summer?
Yes. Yeah, you got 11, 12 months out of the year. And again, we don't need any more studies on summer reading loss. Right. We know we get poor kids to a certain point in June, and they come back to us in September further behind them when they left. That's heartbreaking. Why do we permit that to continue to happen?
I gave you credit to which you have earned on accountability, measurement, metrics, and you talked about that, Tony. What were the results? I mean, we now know that the UK is on track to keep schools open. Do we know enough to know that we can measure that we actually got results, at least in student performance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the student performance at every level is up. And some of the schools that are with some of the worst performers have been turned around. I mean, that's why I was just saying that the thing about education policy is that really you can pretty much know what works. Doing it is very hard, but we, when we track back now and look at the results in key schools, you can see those results very clearly. And extended schools have been, as we call them, have been a big success.
I think we've been joined by Congressman Hoyer, who I'm going to introduce just in a few minutes, but I think we got time for one or two questions from the audience. So, please.
Hi, Prime Minister Blair.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is John Lane. I am a member of George Washington University's radio, The Political Pulse, and I'm a student. But I just have a question for you guys. As a student, as a young person, population is exploding across the globe in the United States, Great Britain. What can the government do? What can other organizations do to inspire young people to become teachers and educators? And how can young people afford to be educators and get in the education profession when the pay is so low and the cost of living is so high?
This is a This is a really important issue. I mean, it's incidentally, there's no area of public services that people don't say it needs more money. It's the first thing. I actually learned when I was Prime Minister, I learned the extraordinary number of ways, euphemisms for we want more money. It would be we need more support. You'd have there would whatever. But and actually in the UK we were lucky in that we were able to offer a substantial uplift in teachers' pay. But I think there is something else which, quite as irrespective of pay, it is the designation of teaching as a really important thing in the community. And we did, I mean, this is very simple and incidentally very British, but we gave the first knighthoods to head teachers who'd done really well. Now, I mean, I know it's very British, but it was absolutely absurd. You would have in the civil service, you'd have in business. This would be, you achieved a certain renown. You of course were recognised by the whole community. It had never happened with teachers. We set up a national college of leadership for teachers. We also introduced a far greater flexibility. I mean, sometimes, it really was a kind of Buggins turn as to how you progressed up the ladder before you managed to become a principal. Actually, if someone's a great educator and they're able to get there earlier, they should get there earlier. So I think it's also about the value you attach to that. And the other thing I think is this, and I think this is really important, and maybe this again is a very specifically British thing, but and I was very much of the view, as I said in my remarks, that the teachers should not have a veto. On the other hand, they should get real support where they're doing the right thing in difficult circumstances. They should not be they should not be left out there without the politicians standing behind them. And, sometimes in our schools where the teachers would do really tough stuff on the discipline side because they had a nightmare situation, I was always first out there to say, I don't want any political correctness about this. If they're trying to get their school properly properly run, then we should be there supporting them. So my view is, of course the money matters, but the value that we attach to the position also matters.
Just to quickly add, and this is a hugely important opportunity for us. We're going to have 1 million teachers retire over the next 5, 6, 7 years. And our ability to attract phenomenally talented folks into education and keep them is going to shape public education for the next 30 years here. It's a real generational shift. And Randy Weingarten is here, who's doing an extraordinary job as the head of the AFT and is a real partner in reform, not just in community schools, but in so many areas. If we can do that well, we'll change public education forever. If we don't do that well, we're going to perpetuate what we're doing. What do we need to do? 2 things. We need to make teachers in the teaching profession the revered profession that it needs to be. And other countries have done a much better job of raising status and raising prestige. So whether it's working with the president, whether it's working with the first lady, I'm always trying to learn something. Maybe we'll start a knighthood campaign here for teachers. But that's a big piece of it. And let me be clear, no one goes into education to make $1 million. Teachers are absolutely underpaid, but they go in with the most altruistic of reasons. And we got to better support that talent. So how do we as a country sort of put a premium on the teaching profession? We have not done that, and we have a chance to break through. Secondly, on the financial side, and this is the law, the lots of things we're fighting for, this is the law, and we have to do a much better job of advertising it. As of July 1st, there's this new thing called income-based repayment, IBR. So people who go into the public sector, people who work for government, people who work at nonprofits or run community schools, people who go into teaching, going forward now, when they graduate from college, their loan repayments will be indexed to their income. And so they won't be financially handicapped and have to go into more lucrative professions. So I hope you're listening carefully. And then after 10 years of public service, after 10 years of teaching, those any remaining loans will be absolutely forgiven, will be erased. And so this is a fundamental breakthrough. So over time, yes, we need to invest more in teachers. We need to particularly reward excellence, which we want to think about. But money, as the Prime Minister said, is always going to be a piece of it. How do we dramatically raise the prestige of the profession? And we have a chance to really break through now. It's an extraordinary opportunity.
Yeah, well said.
Take one more.
I'm Kavita Kadusa with WAMU Public Radio. I have a question. There are some charter schools in DC that are actually sort of cutting back on their extended hours because of security and safety issues, especially as it gets darker. So I wanted to ask how that worked in Chicago.
And we didn't begin to do this perfectly at all, and it's not a DC or Chicago, it's a national issue that often these streets aren't as safe as we would like them to be, and there are real challenges about that. And so I think part of what community schools do is keep children safer longer, 12, 13, 14 hours a day, but children still have to get to and from school safely. They have to still be able to navigate their communities on the weekends. And the safe havens that schools are becoming, while that's a huge step in the right direction, we can't stop at that point. So how do we help move out those boundaries of safety beyond the school? And we didn't talk about this, a whole separate topic, but this idea of promised neighborhoods, of trying to replicate what Jeffrey Canada has done in Harlem, the Harlem Children's Zone, where the schools are the centers of the neighborhood, but it's really taking on an entire community to create that safety net, that network of opportunities, but also the actual physical safety that our children need. With the President's leadership and Congress's bipartisan support, we're going to put out some significant money for planning grants, but ultimately spend hundreds of millions of dollars to try and replicate the Harlem Children's Zone, this promised neighborhood concept around the country. And I think that's ultimately where we have to go. We have to continue to make schools the real safe havens and centers of the neighborhood. But even when we get that, I think the next generation in this is really spreading that safety net and that physical safety beyond the school boundaries. This Harlem Children's Zone promised neighborhood concept, I think, is really, really exciting for the country. And we look forward to investing in a number of places that are willing to partner and collaborate in very different ways to create a network of supports and opportunities for children.
Tony, is that an American problem, or did you face that in the?
No, unfortunately not. No, it is a problem for us too. And the only way is to get the whole of the community involved in it. Certainly, one thing I just want to mention actually about the teachers. As a result of the changes we made, in fact, the numbers of applications, I'm right in saying, Michael, for people to be teachers rose really dramatically. So by the time we finished, I think there really was a different sense of what being a teacher was about.
Well, please join me in thanking Secretary Duncan, Prime Minister Blair, for really a terrific conversation.